NelsonJoypad.com bring you another original.
My fans are gonna freak if they find out that my adventures never happened!
Huh? What fans?
Ah!
Doomsday isn't the first game in the series to bend space-time, and I'm sure it won't be the last. After what some would call a disappointing conclusion to the Deponia franchise, some fans have difficulty letting go as the lead character Rufus had. Surprisingly, even to a games journalist who has covered the company, the developers felt they had more to say and announced and released the series' fourth entry in the span of a week. It would appear Rufus, the man who sacrificed himself at the end of the trilogy, was somehow alive and well. Playing the game from start to finish, I can say with all certainty it's a game made for the fans, but it also has a message you might not enjoy. Deponia starts out with a somber narration from Goal, declaring the end was never our creation, over a beautiful time lapse of the world of Deponia being built. Lush green plant life being cut down to make way for huts. As the walls grew and the buildings developed, the trash eventually overtakes the majesty. She recaps the audience on the history of the previous 3 games in the series, finally landing on how Rufus died.
The end. Oh, you don't like this ending? Still hoping for something more upbeat?
She goes on and asks if she, and in turn the audience, really wants a better ending, or just that it'll never end. The game starts out with an unusually tense segment, a man in an Inuit coat stepping out into a frozen wasteland of what appears to be a Deponian ice age. Voiced by David Hayter, who I would have loved to heard more from, the man enters an organon installation with horrifying creatures on his heel. He fights them off and makes it up to the top room where a huge bomb and a big red button lies before him. He takes off his gear, revealing an older and more bearded Rufus. He hits the button which causes the bomb to fall, accomplishing the original plan of destroying the planet. This, of course, all turns out to be a dream in the mind of young Rufus, still living in Kvatch and dating his soon-to-be ex-girlfriend Tony. Obviously, this is the earliest part of the story, but in a game where time travel is clearly present, this is hard not to expect. Without going into too much of the story specifics, you spend the rest of the game jumping through time with the help of a scientist named McChronicle. Your goal is to, at first, prevent a small accident, but as the game progresses and you discover more about your fate, you work towards correcting not only the mistakes you've made in the previous games, but the new ones from this journey as well. The series has always discussed the impossibility of changing one's fate, and having just played the games again, I found it quite impressively called for the destruction of Rufus throughout the whole experience. Alas, even though I knew these facts, with one character even telling Rufus that he has no future, I still can't help but hate the conclusion that we had. I've grown to care for Rufus despite him being an awful person, and I don't want to see him die. However, the story could possibly switch over to Goal, or perhaps another person entirely. I imagine that's the overall point of the game, is that no one likes a story they love ending. As a creator, I know the fear of committing your characters, as well as your fans, to a purgatory of similarity. Is it better to continue on with characters in a never-ending time loop, or to end their narrative and think of the fun that we once had? While this would have been a perfectly acceptable subtext had the game kept their cards closer to the chest, sadly the developers go into full tilt mode with their motivations for the game. In an almost trolling way, the developers spend the entirety of the game reminding you that you're playing something that you know is going to end once again in disappointment. You jump through a portal only to end up surrounded by broken clocks in a barren desert they call the waste of time. You repeat the same segments and time loops over and over again, as the game repeatedly confirms that everything you do will be cleaned up for the real timeline to happen. While your character runs in circles, so do you. But sadly, these ironic and not so cleverly hidden jokes will ultimately leave you feeling slightly disappointed in what I would only describe as a light entry. This, however, doesn't mean the game is bad. I still enjoyed it completely, but I would be lying if I said it was one of my favorites. It's too stretched for its own good, and needed more meat on the bones in order to justify one of the longer experiences I've had. There are some fantastic moments, however, especially when you go to step foot on the floors of Elysium and speak to their people. What a bunch of idiots. Surrounded by technology and resources, they spend the entirety of their time in leisure, relying on their robotic servants to handle everything. They spend their days having fun in the fun zone, or scrambling up genetic codes to make cute animals. One of the elders explains their lack of self-efficiency by declaring that they have a machine that prevents problems. It's called a computer. They live as gods, and you know what playing around like one gets you. Needless to say, the floating city doesn't fall because of Rufus, or at least entirely because of him. The story is more narratively focused this time around, with less time being spent in one place. Going from one new location to another is interesting, but makes the experience feel more linear, and as such makes the puzzles much easier to figure out. Several of these locations, like an amusement park that serves no real purpose other than padding, could have been cut to really focus in on building characters and ideas. Goal, after speaking with a wiser version of herself, confronts Rufus about his possessive nature, but the team at Daedalic doesn't spend any substantial time on the subject before running through the next portal. It's a shame because the subject matter they broach throughout is fantastic, but they brush it all aside to continue reminding us that, like a Linkin Park song, it doesn't really matter. Because this is a more somber entry as well, the game feels less humorous than it could have been. Of course, there's still jokes to be had, but they feel much more bitter this time around. I couldn't help but loudly proclaim my sadness as I blended up a smiling and oblivious giant maggot in a smoothie. While the shock value of how awful Rufus can be is still there, the writing has sadly taken a backseat to these antics. Jokes aren't nearly as funny as they've been in previous installments, with the majority of chuckles coming from Rufus refusing to say McChronicle's name right. He says things like McMuffin, McCrumdable, McCronipants, and Mick.
Hey, Mick.
There's also humorous insider references to popular films and television.
Hide from a thermonuclear explosion in a refrigerator? That's nuts even by my standards.
But when it comes down to fundamentals, sadly this entry suggests that they might be losing a step in that department. The chorus guy, the man who serenades you in between acts in the first 3 games, only shows up once this time around, right after the bombs drop in the beginning. This is slightly disappointing, but for a game that feels fundamentally different than the previous entries, perhaps this was a wise move. His song is one that laments the previously mentioned notions of denying the trilogy's conclusion.
The sage, it's evident there will be no happy end. Suck it up, princess, no one cares for your tears.
Its musical arrangement taking inspiration by Doctor Who, obviously part of the motivation of the game's wibbly-wobbly timey-wimey approach to the entry. The music and audio are of course wonderful. It always is. It would seem the developers have a fantastic localization department because everyone speaks their lines with conviction and a sense of identity.
That's why I always keep my eyes on both sides. My wife says I've started to squint. It's a good job it's so quiet on the Fulock front. We're not equipped for a war on 2 fronts.
And they've only gotten more comfortable as the series progressed. While I was so disappointed to hear so little of David Hayter's voice, especially after the Metal Gear Solid 5 debacle, I'm at least glad the rest of the cast is just as talented.
The fact you left me in the lurch here? The fact that you then disappeared for several years? Did you really think I'd just sit around here waiting for you? No way, Jose. We've not known each other a whole day.
I've known you much longer.
There's also brand new background music, some of which only hangs around briefly but ranks up with some of the best music put out by a series that already has a fantastic catalog. Hats off to the composer. Visually, the game looks fantastic as usual, with the developers tackling more angles and more locations than I think the series has ever tried before. The team has done some segments that are heavily experimental, but end up paying out in the end, including a montage where you control 4 characters' actions at once. The scope and complicated nature of the scripting may be the reason this installment is the buggiest I've ever experienced in Deponia. I had moments where the game drifted off to the side and froze in place, random lines of text doubling up on screen, and segments that would hide my cursor. Most of these are during the fun zone section of the game, but I had some earlier and later in the experience as well. I don't think I ever had a problem before with any of the previous chapters, so finding these were overly surprising. As a whole, Doomsday is another fun entry in the Deponia series, but fans and newcomers alike will feel like something is missing. Its length and price point suggest that we should take this as a full entry, but the conclusion and message of the game comes across more like a spin-off than a full-fledged continuation. As Rufus says, a crucial part of the game,
Because consequences are important. Without consequences, everything is just pointless.
After my full playthrough, I'm questioning if anything mattered in my pledge to hold my review until I was done. The entry felt more like a retcon to change some particulars before the developers come back with a more ironed out and narratively focused experience. As a fan, I would perhaps wait for a nice Steam sale before shelling out $30 on a surprise entry that answers fewer questions than opens. I love Daedalic Entertainment. They're single-handedly showing that point-and-click adventures are still a viable source for thoughtful and engaging entertainment. While Deponia Doomsday isn't my favorite of the series, it's still worth journeying through once again. The story isn't as focused as it could have been, and spends most of its time justifying the trilogy's ending in some moments that feels more like lecturing than fun. While I agree with the message that the franchise needs a change in order to feel fresh, this entry ends up proving its own point by delivering a product that feels a tad stale. Despite this, Doomsday has only increased my hopes that we get a new trilogy, and if this is the beginning of a new era, I look forward to what the team has in store for the future. My name is Trevor Anderson, Assistant Editor at Mouse and Joypad. If you've enjoyed this review, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching.
It's freaking great.